History often remembers its loudest moments: the clash of empires, the fall of cities, the names of conquerors carved into stone. But between those thunderous chapters lies an era so rich, so transformative, that without it, the modern world would not exist, and yet it is barely spoken of. This is the story of the most underrated era in human history, the Abbasid Golden Age, a time when knowledge traveled faster than armies, when ideas mattered more than bloodlines, and when the world briefly proved that civilization could be built not on conquest, but on curiosity. Imagine a world where Europe is fragmented, literacy is rare, and ancient knowledge is slipping into oblivion. Now shift your gaze eastward to the heart of the Islamic world in the 8th century. But new capital rises from the banks of the Tigris River, Baghdad, not as a fortress, but as a circle, a perfect geometric city designed to reflect harmony between power, faith, and reason. This was no ordinary capital. It was intended to be the intellectual center of the world, and for centuries it succeeded beyond imagination. The Abbasid Revolution had overthrown the Umayyad dynasty, not merely changing rulers, but changing priorities. Where earlier caliphates emphasized expansion, the Abbasids emphasized administration, scholarship, and cultural unity. They ruled over an empire that stretched from North Africa to Central Asia, connecting Greeks, Persians, Arabs, Indians, Jews, Christians, and others under a single political umbrella. What followed was not enforced sameness, but structured diversity, a system where knowledge, regardless of origin, was valued. At the core of this transformation stood an institution unlike anything the world had ever seen: the House of Wisdom. This was not just a library, it was a translation center, a research institute, and a meeting place for scholars of every background. Greek philosophical texts, Indian mathematical treatises, Persian medical manuals, works that might have vanished forever, were translated into Arabic, preserved, debated, and expanded upon. Aristotle survived because Baghdad cared. Euclid endured because Abbasid scholars copied him. Hippocrates lived on because physicians in this era believed healing was sacred. But preservation was only the beginning. The true brilliance of this era lies in what came next. Scholars didn't simply copy ancient knowledge, they challenged it. They corrected errors, proposed alternatives, and built entirely new systems of thought. Algebra was not inherited from the Greeks. It was invented here. The very word algebra comes from al-jabr, a mathematical concept formalized by scholars who sought practical solutions for inheritance laws, architecture, and trade. Medicine, too, underwent a revolution. Hospitals during this era were public institutions, free for all citizens. They included wards, pharmacies, medical schools, and even licensing exams for doctors. The idea that a physician must be tested before practicing medicine, that began here. Medical encyclopedias written during this time remained authoritative in Europe for hundreds of years. Surgical tools were designed. Mental illness was treated with compassion rather than fear, and disease was studied through observation rather than superstition. Astronomy flourished under Abbasid patronage. Observatories were built. Star catalogs were compiled with astonishing accuracy. Scholars calculated the Earth's circumference within a fraction of the true value, nearly 1,000 years before modern instruments. Timekeeping improved, navigation advanced, and maps became more precise. These weren't abstract exercises. They affected prayer schedules, trade routes, agriculture, and travel across continents. And then there was philosophy. At a time when questioning the universe could get you condemned elsewhere, Abbasid society encouraged debate. Rationalists argued with theologians. Philosophers reconciled faith and reason. Free will, ethics, logic, and the nature of reality were not forbidden topics. They were nightly conversations. Knowledge was not seen as a threat to belief, but as a path toward understanding it more deeply. What makes this era even more extraordinary is how inclusive it was. Scholars were Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Persian, Arab, Turk, and Greek. Religion did not define intellectual worth. Merit did. A brilliant mind could rise regardless of background. This environment produced thinkers whose works would later ignite the European Renaissance, often without credit. When European scholars rediscovered Aristotle, they did so through Arabic translations. When Renaissance mathematicians learned algebra, it came from Abbasid texts. When early universities formed curricula, they unknowingly echoed Baghdad. Yet despite all this, the Abbasid Golden Age is often reduced to a footnote, overshadowed by later conflicts, colonial narratives, or simplistic portrayals of the medieval world as dark. The irony is painful. The so-called Dark Ages in Europe coincided with one of the brightest intellectual periods in human history elsewhere. So why did it end? Not with a single collapse, but with a slow erosion. Political fragmentation weakened centralized patronage. Internal conflicts drained resources. Then came the Mongols. In 1258, Baghdad fell. Libraries burned. Scholars were killed. Books were thrown into the Tigris River until the water, according to legend, ran black with ink. Whether literal or symbolic, the loss was real. Centuries of accumulated knowledge vanished in days. But even then, the ideas survived. They had already spread to Spain, to Sicily, to Byzantium. They crossed borders, languages, and generations. The Abbasid Golden Age did not die. It transformed the world quietly, invisibly, leaving fingerprints on mathematics, medicine, science, and philosophy that we still use today. This era matters because it challenges a dangerous myth that progress belongs to one civilization, one culture, one time. It proves that when societies value learning, fund education, and protect intellectual freedom, humanity leaps forward. When they don't, knowledge burns. The most underrated era in history is not underrated because it lacked greatness. It is underrated because history is often written by power, not by wisdom. And wisdom rarely shouts. It builds. It teaches. It waits. If this era had been better remembered, perhaps our modern world would understand something essential. That cooperation outperforms conquest. That diversity fuels innovation. And that knowledge is humanity's greatest inheritance. And if you found this story worth telling, then perhaps it's time to give this forgotten age the recognition it deserves. Like the scholars of Baghdad, keep curiosity alive, share the story, and remember, history is not just what happened. It's what we choose not to forget.